Welcome again, everyone. I'm so happy that you could join us for Tips, Truths, and Takeaways about Organizational Culture. I'm Janita Robinson, and I'm the MSI Mission Sustainability Initiative Director at Forefront. Forefront is the statewide association for nonprofits, foundations, and advisors to nonprofits. I wanted to actually just do a little introduction about the MSI before we get started with our wonderful webinar that's going to be featuring Terra, Winston, and Marty McConnell. But before we do that, I wanted to also give you all a chance to introduce yourselves, although I know a number of you on the Zoom right now know each other. And first, I would welcome you. You are welcome to rename yourself. And if you don't know how to do that on your picture, you can hit the 3 little dots, or in the participant list next to your name, you can hit more, and you are welcome to add your preferred pronouns and also the name of your organization that you're with as well. So as you can see, I've renamed myself as she, her, which are my preferred pronouns, and then also MSI. This is going to be interactive, and to start with, we're going to be doing some introductions of everybody. So I'll call on folks, but just to let you know, so you're not caught off guard, we'll basically be going in alpha order by first name to introduce ourselves. And I just ask that you say your name, you can share your organization, but why don't you share with us what you might be binge watching or binge reading right now. So I've already introduced myself. I will share that I actually have started watching on Netflix. It's called Boren, B-O-R-E-N, and it is a friend, I see the looks, yeah. A friend recommended this to me. The name would never have caught my eye, but it is about a female Danish prime minister. So it is like the sort of early good years of House of Cards, maybe, maybe a little West Wing-ish, so a good political drama. So that's what I'm watching right now. Amy, if you're ready, I know you just joined, but we'll go to you.
Hi, thanks. Sorry I was late. My name is Amy Clark. I'm a Director of Partnerships at Illinois Legal Aid Online. And what I'm binging right now is The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is creepy, super creepy.
Okay, getting with the season. Eric?
My name is Eric Sutter. I'm the Senior Vice President at Epic. And I just finished Ratchet, Mildred Hatchet on Netflix, which was pretty cool. And this can be gory too, so, but it was very good.
Okay. Hope, I will go ahead, Hope.
Hi everyone, my name is Hope Rhodes. I am the retention specialist at Epic, and The Bachelorette started again, so that's really the only thing I'm watching.
Julia.
I actually go by my middle name, Kim,
Okay.
so everybody here knows that. I'm the president CEO at Epic, and I am boring in that I do a lot with open minds. It's also another type of informational networking. They constantly are sending you stuff, so trying to keep up with that. And my husband farms, so I usually am being asked to bring him something to eat and sit on the combine for like an hour or 2 sometimes in the evening. So yeah, I'm not around the TV as much. So anyway.
Katie.
Hello, my name is Katie Murphy. I'm the Senior Director of Employment Services at Epic. And I also am binging Haunting of Bly Manor right now.
Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Davis. I'm a grant writer at Epic, and I have always really been into the Great British Baking Show, so I'm very excited that they've got a new season. And to watch people like normally just hugging and helping each other and not having to stay 6 feet away.
Just a little editorial. It's on Hulu, but British Best Home Cook, which has Mary Berry, who used to be on the Great British Baking Show, is also very good. Rachel.
Hi, I am Rachel Greystone. I'm the curriculum coordinator here at EPIC, and I feel really behind the times, but right now our household is binging The Office.
Great. And Greg, I know that you just joined us, so we're just doing quick introductions of who we are and then sharing what we're binge watching or binge reading. I guess you could also do binge eating, but I guess.
Thanks, Janita. Welcome. Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Van Hefty. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Yoga Care. And I don't really binge watch stuff, but my partner and I are watching we alternate between Nashville, Schitt's Creek, and Kimmy
Schmidt.
Kimmy Schmidt, yeah. Yes. And audio podcasting. I do kind of binge listen to Brene Brown.
So I'm going to go to our presenters. Marty.
I'm Marty, she, her, hers. I am binging basically like every nature documentary available on like Netflix and Hulu and stuff. So it's like Our Planet, Blue Planet, Planet Earth, Planet at Night. And because I just like need to take my nervous system like down and hear some like soothing information about what's going on like on the ocean floor.
Good. Terra and then Emily.
So I'm thinking about binging Haunting of Bly Manor. So give me a thumbs up if it's worth it. Okay, all right, good. What I just finished is on Netflix, Atypical, which is a family drama about a kid with autism, and it's phenomenal.
Emily.
Emily here again. I'm the manager of education for Forefront. Love the Great British Baking Show. I'm a little disappointed with this year. They just don't seem to, it's good, but they seem to be just a little less witty, a little less, I don't know, maybe they're more nervous. Who knows? But I'm watching. And anything like a Scandinavian murdery show with subtitles, I'm down with that. There's a lot of them.
Wonderful. Well, I hope this adds to people's watch list. So before I turn it over to Terry and Marty, I just want to give a little bit of a background about the Mission Sustainability Initiative, which is sponsoring today's program. So the MSI is focusing on strengthening the social impact sector by building resources in a learning culture around partnerships. And by partnerships, we mean anything that's long-term or permanent that changes the way of doing business for both organizations involved. People often think that we just mean partnerships as a code word for mergers, and that is not true. We actually mean co-location, shared staffing, back office collaborations, programmatic joint ventures, really ways to truly enhance mission and hopefully serve more people or advance causes more effectively and more efficiently. So MSI really does four things. We do education like this. We provide confidential technical assistance to any nonprofit that wants to talk about what they're thinking about in terms of a partnership, and you can do that by reaching out to me. And then we refer people to other experts like consultants who have experience in negotiating partnerships, people who can do rebranding about partnerships. And also we work very closely with the Lawyers Committee under the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law in their Pro Bono Works program, which matches nonprofits with free legal assistance to help on a multitude of issues, including partnerships. And then finally, we give out grants for the one-time costs to help explore or implement a partnership. So as part of the education, we're really happy to bring today's event to you. We had done this in person a couple of years ago, and it was a really popular workshop. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the translation here into Zoom world. I will tell you, as it relates to partnerships, people say that culture is the hardest part to figure out. It's not the money, it's not the staffing, it is the culture. And it is the most lingering issue. And as with all things about partnerships, in order to do it in a partnership, you first have to figure out what's going on in your own organization, right? I'll try to resist this, but partnerships, we often use the relationship analogy, and it is like in a relationship, right? You cannot be happy in a relationship unless you can find happiness on your own. And you cannot figure out the culture of a new partnership unless you are understanding of your own culture to start with. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marty and Terra to talk about the importance of knowing your own values and your culture. I do just want to sort of add a little bit. I know you were sent links to their bios. I will just give my hearty endorsement to Terra, who is an amazing coach, who has a background in engineering and an MBA, and refers to herself as a ringleader. And then also to Marty, who calls herself a strategy and language maven, who beyond her skills at strategy is also a poet as well. So with that, I will happily turn over to Terra and Marty.
And I'll go first, and then can I just put the amen on the fact that Marty is a maven on a lot of things? Trust and believe. It's so good to be here this morning. You know, Janita talked about kind of culture being one of the hardest things and lingering challenges for partnerships. But let's be real, with the work that Marty and I do, and we see all the time in organizations, culture is just the thing, right? Pre-merger, post-merger, in life, in families, in relationships, culture is that thing that either amplifies and makes things work great, or when there is tension or conflict, it comes from there. I mean, to be honest, parts of kind of what we're going to talk about from a culture perspective, I talk about in diversity training. Why? Because our individual cultures, where they clash, is usually where we have diversity issues, right? So culture across the board is that thing that has so much of a bearing in how satisfied and fulfilled we feel in the relationships and the environments that we exist in, and at the same time is the core of a lot of the challenges that we have in workplaces and in groups of people. And yet it's the thing that we probably don't define very well, right? When you say like it's the culture, everyone goes, yeah, that thing, the culture. And then like some places they're talking about ping pong tables, and then other places they're talking about performance review processes. And you know, there's infamously a line from one of the Supreme Courts at one point saying, well, how do you define porn? And they say, well, I know it when I see it. And we kind of define culture like, yeah, the thing we know when we see. So in order for us to really have a good conversation about kind of why culture matters and how do we make sure that our cultures are in alignment, we kind of have to start with defining what culture is. So I'm going to share my screen just to kind of go through a few slides. Now, what that means is when I do that, I can only see the screen. I can't even see me. So if you have a question, take yourself off of mute, because I probably won't notice it in the chat or whatever. It's a small enough group that won't be an issue. We got a deal? Thumbs up, deal? Cool. All right. So very first question is, what is culture? Let's see if I can make this big enough for you. All right. So culture in general, when we're not just talking about organizational cultures, that's just one type of culture, but across the board, culture in general is how we cope with the world. It's this set of rules that inside our head says, this is how we should be and this is how we should be. If we did not have these aligned rules, it would be chaos. We'd be running around, making everybody mad, stumbling over each other. It is something that is passed between generations. And again, it's family generations. It can be passed through work generations, right? So, think about your organization. So, Greg, you're a founder of your organization, which means that you got to set the history, but you've been in other places, and you realize that it's almost like you can tell how organization has evolved by talking to people who have been in the organization longer and longer. It's almost like you can count the rings on a tree. Like the people who were here 20 years ago and the people who just got here yesterday have a different version of what that culture is, right? So it's passed and learned, but it evolves. It's like a little bit like a game of telephone. So it shapes some of everything, our perceptions, our judgments, our ideas of what's okay and what's not, right? So culture, and this is gonna sound so crazy. I want you to think back in the days when we could breathe the same air safely. And you would go to a place and you hit the button on the elevator, you walk into the elevator, everybody walks in the elevator and immediately turns around. You don't have to do that. Like culture tells us to do that. Can you imagine if someone walked into, if you were in an elevator, someone walked in and they just faced you for the whole ride? Highly uncomfortable. But no one said you couldn't do that. Like it's like if you read the elevator manual, it does not say that. But culture tells us that that is the right answer. And so across the board, that voice in your head that tells you like, oh, this is not good, I shouldn't do this, comes from your culture. It can be specific to any size group, right? So there is a dominant culture in an area. So we are a dominant US Western culture. But even beneath that, you will have subcultures, again, of any size, based on your experiences, based on the groups of people that you have to collaborate with. So there's a country culture. Work has a different culture than play, right? So if you think about kind of perhaps places where you worship, or if you're in an intramural team, there may be a culture of that team that is different than the culture that you have when you're at work. Your family has a culture that is very different than other families. And that may or may not be linked from where you came from originally, or your ancestors did, but there will be things. Your friends have a separate culture that is different. And it has its own rules and its own language at times. So if I'm with a group of my friends and a very handsome gentleman passes by, we may say to each other, and we all know what that means. And then if somebody comes by wearing something that we don't think they should be wearing, we will all say, and we know what it means, right? So your culture has tempos and language. It has a way of being. Your culture is very specific. Now, the thing that is so crazy is that it's invisible. It's completely invisible. And so we tend to walk around assuming that my culture and your culture have the same tempos, have the same language, have the same challenges. And when organizations are in partnership, they're like, we all kind of know, like, yeah, we're all good people. So we must have cultures that are similar enough. And that's usually where people start to run into roadblocks. Now, the question is, how do you learn and teach culture? So come off of mute. I'm curious about in your organizations, how is your culture taught?
I think it's taught through example, just seeing the majority of people act in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like we have to become chameleons. And be honest, and Hope, I think it was Hope, right?
Yes.
Thank you. When we're young, that's the first way we absorb culture. Like we're watching our parents, we're watching people around us, and so you start to realize, okay, when this person does this, everyone's mad at them. Or when this person did this thing, they got promoted or they got accolades, they got rewarded. And so very quickly we start to absorb what that culture is based on those things. What other tools do you have to communicate your culture?
Because we're a human service agency, and humans and how we support them is our product or our service line, so to speak. I think it's like Hope said, it is more by observation. It's a more visual type of example. Yeah. Just kind of building on what she said, which I think makes it hard. Because again, I just was talking to a manager the other day, and her comment was, well, the new workforce just doesn't have the work ethic. Okay, well, what does that really mean? And I've read and followed stuff on the different generational, and their commitments and what that all means. And we definitely have not spent enough time defining how we still respect and we still see that work ethic, but it's different. I mean, myself and Eric have been here 30 plus years. So obviously when you were talking about how people that have been there for a long time, and then I look at Katie and Rachel and Hope, who are relatively new, I mean, we're gonna see what's important and our responsibilities and how we measure that we're doing a good job differently. And so we definitely need work with this. So I've talked too long, so.
No, you did not. How dare you? Exactly. And because so often, like both of you said, so often the way people absorb our culture is through observation. When we are in COVID time, and so much of our observation for people is within this little screen right here, right? We don't get to see kind of all around the edges. It's getting even harder to communicate what those values are about what the culture is. Other tools that you do have, though, you are communicating culture with every employee handbook, every rule book, everything there, like that says something about who you are and how you show up. Even the processes that you use, right? So for an organization that does not do performance ratings at all, which is often very, very common in very small organizations, it says something about what performance means to us, right? That says something about the culture. If we only had 3 people and we did performance reviews, right, that says something about the culture, right? So even the ways that we put things in place are communicating, even when we don't think we are communicating, right? The language that we use. And so you're constantly kind of pushing out culture in ways that people don't always even know that they are. And one thing that we're going to talk about in a minute is kind of what is your lived culture versus your espoused culture, because people experience your culture as a lived culture, right? All right, so
I think another part for culture as well is your interactions. How that is so important, and how you need to take the time to listen to what people are saying and show empathy when needed, show that you're listening and you understand. But then if it's something that you disagree with, it's on how you try to get your point through it in a non-threatening way at times. And that's all about culture as well.
Eric, yes, that's huge. Actually, I was on a call yesterday, and we were talking about how to give feedback. And we're teaching this very kind of, like I said, high empathy way. And a person was actually teaching for a business school. And the person said, does that work in every environment? And the other facilitator had to say, no. There are some environments like, private equity or hedge funds where if you show too much vulnerability, you will be laughed at. And that's a culture, right? It's not a great culture between you and me, but it is a culture, and it's a choice. And so, like you said, the interactions go very far in showing, if you're walking the talk around what your values are and what your culture is, right? So I actually want to expand on what Eric and actually Kim and Hope just said, because I want you to think about culture not just as a big nebulous piece, but more so around the elements that make up a culture. So for your culture, there's the ideals, right? That's the thing in your mind. It is, when we say culture, it's the values that we have, right? Are we loyal? Are we transparent? Are we honest, right? So values are kind of the big things. Think mom and apple pie types of things. And we all have value statements on our websites. Whether or not we live up to them is a whole nother thing, but it's one of those kind of things that everyone says, you gotta have values. Along with that are the beliefs that come with that, right? So we have some general beliefs about how people should interact and how people should be. Like, if I have a belief that we should be empathetic, that's still a belief. That's not an absolute truth. There's no natural law on one of these nature shows that Marty's been binge watching. There's no natural law that says you must be empathetic. In fact, the law of nature is a lot less empathy and a lot more lions eating deer. But I have a belief that we should be empathetic. So your beliefs in your organization, things around that people should have a strong work ethic, Kim, right? And what does that mean? Gender roles, particularly when it comes to young people, the workplace right now, we have the generations we have, the relationship between boss and subordinate is a really big one that is being poked at quite a bit. Because younger generations, there tends to be a more a flat a flat expectation. So even if you're my manager, I can challenge you in different ways than 5 years ago, maybe we would not have challenged a manager. So what does that relationship mean? All of those are beliefs that exist in an organization. And honestly, these are the often undefined things in our culture that pop up and cause challenges. So we've got the ideal side. On the right-hand side, we have actions. Ideals are in our head, right? So right now I could run down this, each one of you, when we come up with a list of ideals that you have about your own personal culture and about the organizational culture, but it's not in your head and I can't read your mind. Like, I'm good. I'm not that good though. The only way that I experience your beliefs, your values, is by your behaviors, right? So behaviors are the observable things, right? So you say you respect me, and we're gonna talk about respect in a minute. I'll tell you what, that's my least favorite word in the world. You say you respect me, what are you doing to show you respect me? That's the only way I can interpret what you're espousing to me. So behaviors, and so it's how I treat you, it's how we interact in groups. It could be things like memos, as little as that sounds, how I dress, all of that are my behaviors. The other piece, and I think this is the one that we don't process a lot, is what is the range of what is permissible? Because we love to think that we're black and white. So we can say right now, we believe in integrity. The behavior to support that is that we don't lie. Really? So if somebody comes in, they bring a picture of that little ugly baby, like is it acceptable to say the baby is cute even though you don't believe the baby is cute? Is it acceptable to just not say anything? Right? What is the range of permissible? So it's okay to lie about a baby, but not about the finances, right? So in every organization, even the things that we feel are absolute, usually outside of cardinal sins and crimes, there's more wiggle room than we like to admit. And that wiggle room is where sometimes people can get tripped up, particularly when they're moving between organizations or you're partnering together. Right. So I want you to think about, a value that you have and what are the behaviors that people are expected to exhibit in order to honor that value. Because where it gets twisted, so I joined PepsiCo a couple of years ago, before I started my business. I joined it right after they had purchased Quaker Oats. So PepsiCo, East Coast company, based in New York, upstate New York. Quaker Oats, a Chicago-based company, Midwestern company. And PepsiCo, one of the values was a sense of urgency, right? What I would hear, because I didn't have any skin in the game, I had not belonged to either legacy company. When I would go to New York, people would say, those people at Quaker did not have a sense of urgency. And I would ask, how do you know? And they said, do you see how slowly they walk in the hallways? For some reason, the history of PepsiCo, as people were starting to value urgency, I am sure, I've never seen it written in a document, thou must be urgent, right? But it was something that was rewarded. It was something that they pride themselves on. And the busiest people were always kind of racing from place to place. And like Hope said, people watch that. So even if I wasn't busy, I would race to the cafeteria, and race to the bathroom, and race to the car. And that started to be an emblem of it, right? And so, when I go into an organization and start doing kind of cultural consulting, I start with what is your espoused culture? That's the values and beliefs, that's the stuff you talk about. I very quickly go and start understanding what's happening. And so all the unwritten rules of your culture will appear in the actions. And so if you're ever wondering what have you accidentally wrought into your culture, think about the actions, the behaviors, the patterns that you see over and over again that you don't like. And there's usually something that either from a policy, practice, or even just a mindset perspective, usually of the leaders, that's something that you've actually introduced in the culture. And it's going to take deliberate, intentional work to bring back out. Any questions about culture, about the elements?
Yes. I'm really thinking about some examples in our organization where some of this has shown up, and particularly around decision making. processes. And you talk about kind of vertical and horizontal and consensus or hierarchical and who makes the decision. And in an executive director role, I'm also like espousing, and I think our organizational values and culture espouse collaboration. And sometimes that's challenging as far as like, I want your input, but if I don't accept it, or if the outcome or doesn't align with that input, then some people can feel hurt or that their input wasn't included, even though in other cases, like it is. And so sometimes it's this decision basis, but it's that kind of, decision-making process, I think, is really key in trying to figure out, trying to be as collaborative as possible when there's still like someone or some process that needs to make the decision.
Greg, I love that you brought that up because it speaks to the importance of really being intentional and specific about the values and the culture you're putting together, right? Collaboration does not mean harmony. And it's very easy to get those two things mixed up, right? Especially if I want my idea to be the one that's taken, right? And so to say that we can be collaborative and we can have conflict, right? There's collaboration and there's all voices being heard doesn't mean we're listening to all voices. And so making those distinctions, that's why the word respect is one of my least favorite values to put out there, because it means so many different things to different people when it comes to behavior, right? So I get to say, like, if you respect me, you will listen to my opinion. If you respect me, you will take my opinion. If you respect me, you will give me the first opinion. If you respect me, you will fight with my opinion. If you respect me, you will show up on time. If you respect me, you will leave things early. It literally covers everything. So if anyone has respect in your value statement, my recommendation is on the next strategic plan to turn that into words that actually mean what you mean. Do you mean kindness? Do you mean conscientiousness? Do you mean all voices being heard? Like just make it more specific, because it hides every kind of ill. But don't be afraid to make the distinction when people push back and say, you said collaboration, now you're not being collaborative, to define what collaboration means. And you can do that with any one of your cultural values. You get to define it for yourself and then live it. Marty, you want to talk a little bit about why cultures matter so much?
Sure. Yeah, so that's actually a really great segue. I mean, I was thinking about, like, in that sort of example of decision making and how it's influenced by culture, like there's a really important distinction between and overlap, really, like sort of a Venn diagram between our organizational culture and our organizational systems, right? So we value, let's say, collaboration and consensus-based decision making. What are the systems that live that out, right? Like, are all decisions made by vote? Are decisions made, like, people, is it hierarchical, but there's always discussion? Is it, all these sort of, like, there are systems that can indicate how we intend to live out our organizational culture. I think a couple of things about why this is so important. I mean, we have to know our culture in order to change our culture, which is a really obvious thing to say, but something I'm always sort of trying to keep in mind, which is that if we don't, if we aren't aware of both our espoused culture and our lived culture, we can't make intentional change, right? It's the same way that, like, when you set up a strategic plan, you lay out like your goals for year 1, year 2, year 3, you know that, like, some of those steps might change and the world is in constant flux, but you have a plan. And so when you need to make changes, you're able to intentionally do so. You say, okay, we're going to take step B and move it to point A, and I'm going to, move these things around. In the same way, if we know what our organizational culture is, which is not one thing, right? Organizations are not a monolith. And so if we can say, well, really, like, this is how our organization essentially functions at the executive level, right? Like, this is how our leadership team makes decisions. And also, these are how our people on the ground, this is sort of the organizational culture there. And then our board has a culture, and that's how it functions. it's okay if there are sort of subcultures like Terra was talking about. Like there will be different ways that different groups function, but until we're aware of that, we can't do anything about or with it. And what happens really often, and what is really dangerous, both in organizational functioning and particularly when we get into the question of strategic collaborations, mergers, intensive work together on any level, is that we assume that how the team at the top functions is how the organization functions, right? Like, oh, our decision-making processes are 100% consensus-based because, you know, the directors sit down and they discuss things and they make a decision. And then you talk to the people who are, you know, sort of boots on the ground, front line, and they're like, we are not a consensus-based decision-making organization. And they may be fine with that, but it's simply different, right? They're like, all I know is decisions come down from the top, and those are things we are to carry out. And like, they might be cool with that, or they might not be, but it really, you know, this oftentimes when we go into collaborations and mergers, what we do is we talk to the executive team and we talk to the board and we say, what is your organizational culture? And then they name the things that they, you know, are espousing. And it may or may not have anything to do with the reality of the full organization. You know, I want to talk for a minute about, because this is, you know, MSI, and this is, we're sort of talking about in this context of mergers and collaborations, about why that's so important when we go to work with other organizations. When one of the things that's a concept that's super helpful for me to keep in mind, and this is really even true if you like I worked for an organization where there were sort of two primary departments, and then the decision was made to combine those because they were siloed. It's like, oh, well, we'll just put them together. And there wasn't a recognition that the two departments have really different subcultures. So even when we're looking at that, we tend to treat organizations, which are human systems, we tend to treat them like machines, right? Like, okay, we can just swap this part out, put this part in, and it'll function, right? But that's not true. These are human systems. And when we combine two subsets, right, either two organizations or two departments, or, you know, sometimes it's like 3 or 4, what we're doing is moving from what's called a post-identity group, which is where the individuals in the group have sort of started to trust the whole to take care of them. They identify as part of this group. And then we put them together and we become a pre-identity group, a group where it's like, all right, well, I gotta watch out for myself. I no longer identified primarily as like a team member or a department member. All of a sudden I'm an individual again. And I'm like, I don't know how this is gonna work. I feel unsafe. And so there are a lot of ways to handle that, largely by sort of saying, okay, let's identify how we're going to function. Let's talk about what worked in sort of the old ways, like when we were separate, and let's talk about how we want to work together as a new unit. The last thing I want to say about this is that because I come from this, what's called an appreciative inquiry organizational development approach, I'm just constantly talking about, like, look for the light, look for what's working, right? So when we bring groups together, cross-department, cross-organization, we want to be able to look at those ways of functioning, the organizational culture and subcultures, and say, when are we most effective? And this is what we'll be talking about when we get into some breakout rooms in the second hour, is when our organization is thriving, what are the organizational culture aspects that we are exhibiting? Because that's what we want to build on, right? Like, we could look at our organizational culture, like Terra was talking about, like the sense of urgency. Like, my question is, like, is that serving you? Like, is this organization thriving due to, and in moments of its sense of urgency? Maybe, maybe not, like, I'm agnostic on this. Like, I'm assigning no judgment to it, but we need to know, like, is this effective for us or not? And then who is it effective for? Like, oh, that's really effective for the folks at the top, because people are cranking it out. But maybe for the humans themselves, they're like, sure, I'm hyper productive in the short term, but I'm also completely burning out, right? And so we need to be thinking about multiple levels of how these things affect folks at all levels of the organization, how our values and culture are lived out. And we have to surface those and find ways to have the vulnerable conversation about whether or not that's working. Like when Terra's talking about, like at PepsiCo, for somebody to say, I'm not sure this culture of urgency is really serving us, would be a very vulnerable act, right? And in a lot of organizations, it's like that, even, you know, in nonprofits, right? Like we have, with nonprofits, it tends to be, in my experience, this sort of disasterizing and martyr complex, right? Like the person who is most fried out, who's like at the edge of just losing it all the time, is like that person. That's our star, right? Like that person is really doing it. They're putting themselves on the line. And that's a very dangerous thing for us to reify as an organizational value. And nobody has it on their website. Like we value burnout, you know? But it becomes this kind of unspoken organizational cultural aspect. And so we want to create spaces where we can surface that. And the very last thing I'll say is that the reason we're going to do the kind of process that we're going to just do a little taste of in the second half, where we're going to break into pairs to talk about it, is that we get at the truth of those things by telling the stories, by talking about what has happened, what our actual lived experiences have been. And they don't have to be big, epic experiences. It's the day-to-day moments that make up our actual organizational culture and our actual work lives. And that's where the truth lives, not in, you know, what those of us at the top, you know, hope is true or real. Yeah. Hey, we're almost at 11. Do we want to take a quick bio break before we go into the next part? Terra, how do you feel about that?
I'm good with that. So give us a thumbs up if you want a break. All right, we do have some breakers. So biology always wins out, just so y'all know. That's my culture. Biology wins out. Miss Janita, how long is our break?
Oh, I think we have a good 10-minute break at least. Yeah.
All right, so 10 minutes, stretch your legs, get some coffee or something stronger. And when we come back, we're gonna talk a little bit more about some of those truths that Marty talked about. Okay, 10 minutes.
So that puts us at 11. I can't do math. Just after 11. 11:03. So y'all can just turn off your audio and video if you want to. And I'm going to put us facilitators in our facilitator room. I'm going to send y'all to it, and then I'm going to join you. Oh, I don't want to do that. How do I? Darn. Oh, here we go. Okay. Come on, go.
There's so much clicking.
I know, sorry. For some reason, it's not letting me open the room without opening all the breakout rooms, but I don't want to do that.
Oh.
No, come on. Darn, darn, darn. I know I did this with another group and it worked.
Do you guys want to mute yourself and I'll conference call you on my phone?
Sure. Let's go.
See? Old school.
have you been, Janita?
Muted. I'm good, actually. This is being recorded, Greg, by the way.
Oh, okay, I see.
Even if it weren't, I would say it was good, but I just,
Yeah.
oh, good to see you. Good to
You too, you too. Is it going to be shared with the, is there, it's going to be shared in a section where like members can look at it, or?
Yeah, we haven't actually decided. It'll probably be, I think I'll share it on the MSI page, which will mean that actually it'll be open to the public, actually, because we don't restrict the MSI materials. So yeah, and actually I'm excited about that because, as I mentioned, and I'm not sure if you're on yet, we did this workshop in person 2 years ago in 2018. It was very popular. So I think people really appreciate being able to see the recording. The breakouts that we do coming up are not recorded. So, and that'll be announced also at the start. But yeah, I think Terry and Marty just have amazing things to say about culture.
For sure. This is great. Thanks for having it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for people returning promptly. We've got just a couple more minutes of our break.
Hi, Janita. I have a question.
Sure, Amy, go ahead.
I apologize. I have a conflict. I'll have to jump off at 11:30, and I don't want to be disruptive. I know we're breaking up in a pair, so I didn't know if it would be best if I not be in a pair. I'm not sure exactly when we're going to do that and come back.
Yeah, we actually, the timing will work out, and Marty can correct me so that you can do the breakout, actually, Amy.
Okay.
And then, yeah, so appreciate your letting us know, but you'll be able to do the breakout. And then since this is being recorded, you can catch the end of it once we post it online.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's 12. It is 11:03. I'm sorry. I'm on the East Coast, so I have to keep do the math backwards. It's 11:03. You want us to get started?
Yeah, I think Rachel, I can't tell it, Eric, but I think why don't we go ahead and start back?
Yep. All right. So where we left off, we were talking about kind of the truths of an organization. Oh, Rachel? Rachel is here. She's here. Hi, Rachel. What I want to do is just take a few minutes to explore a couple areas, like values areas, where we tend to find cultures have a lot of conflict and trouble, but no one actually says it out loud, right? So you'll indulge me on these two areas, and we'll get to explore how they may be playing out in your organizations or could play out in partnerships, right? So I'm gonna start with the first one is about rules. Now, when it comes to rules and values, what way smarter people than I am in the study of values have found is that there really is a continuum of orientations, cultural orientations around rules from 1 to 5, right? I made the numbers, but the idea at 1 is the idea that fixed rules. If it is a rule, is a rule. You follow rules. That's what you do. Someone wrote the rules for a good reason. You should follow the rules, right? That is an orientation. In the middle, you find that there are some people whose cultural orientation is flexible rules, right? Like, you follow the rules, right? Like, but there are some rules that are a little bit bendy. So for example, if you speed on the road, that is a rule that you are technically not following. And if that gives you some concern, then you may not be as fixed rules as you think you are, right? But so there are some rules that we abide by, and there's some rules that are flexible, and I am an arbiter of that myself. Is what someone would say if that is your cultural orientation. And on the far end of the spectrum is the idea that there are no rules. Now, no rules don't mean complete anarchy, but what you will hear in a no rules culture will say it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. Or you'll hear everything's negotiable, right? So all cultures are valid, all cultures exist. They exist in any of the subcultures. So your family, It could be something in your organization. It could be something in countries, entire countries, right? So I want you to think about where you may fall in this continuum. Are you closer to the one side, fixed rules? Are you in between fixed and flexible, right? So I want to run a quick poll. So keep that in mind. Let's see if I can get my polling to work. All right, first one, rules. So click where you think you may fall. Like, I know it's hard because you want to be a 2.7, but the poll isn't that specific. So are you more flexible rules, like a 1? Are you 2, like between fixed and flexible? Are you no rules? So go ahead and click where you fall. All right, give you another second if anyone hasn't responded. One more person thinking about it. All right. Boom. All right, so here are results. So in our little group, we have people that are between fixed and flexible, flexible, and between flexible and no rules. Like, think about how wide that is. How does this play out in an organization when we know we've got people that fall in different spaces? So can I have someone who is between flexible and no rules? So tell me, when you see someone that maybe is a complete fixed rules, right? Every rule must be followed. How do you feel about that type of person?
No room to negotiate, no room to make a case, no room. They're just strictly, it doesn't matter. So we know where they're at. Yeah.
So what ends up happening is we don't just say like, oh, they're just different cultural orientations. That's fine. No, we're like, this person's a pain in the butt. Every little thing, they're stickler for something. You may like, particularly if that person's in finance and you have to do the budget with this person. You're like, oh my God, what's going on? But at the same time, if I am from a fixed rules orientation and I'm dealing with a culture that is no rules, it is really frustrating to me, right? It feels like the wild, wild west. I feel like I can't trust anybody. Like, if there's nothing that's true, then what is anything true? And so, identifying, again, every organization has rules, but identifying how you align to those rules goes a long way in helping people better work together. And again, particularly when you have got partnerships with other organizations, this starts to come up and play very seriously. All right, so let's try. Let's see if I can. Way too much technology happening now. I got slides, I got polls. Fall out, people. All right, so I want to give you just one more cultural area to look at, and this is around conflict, right? So in conflict, again, we talk about our continuum. On the one end, like we're number 1, there are some cultures that are issues are not openly acknowledged. In order for me to have a good relationship with you, what could be so important for us to bristle? Like, you know what? I got it. It's fine. I'll do it. I'll fix it. It's okay. I'd rather not create any waves because I want to honor our relationship. So if you move a little bit to the right, you'll see for some cultures, the idea that key issues should be resolved. So if it's really big and we need to talk about it, but if it's nothing, like, why raise it? Why cause a stink? I mean, like, we're good because I want to maintain our relationship. On the far end, where you see number 5, you have some cultures that say all issues, everything, big, little, yesterday's issues, stuff for tomorrow, all issues should be resolved. And I do that because I would never want anything, no matter how small, to stand in the way of our relationship. So you notice they're all about relationship, but it's just the way that I go at honoring the power and the importance of that relationship. So think about where you fall between 1 and 5. I'm gonna do another poll. Bring the poll up. Boom, poll. Where do you fall from 1, issues are not openly acknowledged, to 5, all issues resolved? So I need to see, this is when I need my Jeopardy music. See, I can see what's going on, and I'm very excited to see this. So that's very interesting. Every group is different when we kind of ask this question. If you're struggling, don't think too much. Go off your first instincts, because there's no good and no bad in this. All right. I'm going to close it in 3, 2, 1. All right. We'll share the results. Okay. So we've got a good number of between key issues and all issues. We have some that fall on either side. Now I want you to think about how this plays out. This one I would say is probably the one that is the most distressing in organizations and where people tend to have the most misunderstandings. So if I am someone who believes that I shouldn't acknowledge any issues at all, and you are someone who would believe we should talk about all issues, what do you think when we interact? What do you think happens? Come off of mute. Somebody tell me what happens.
Someone's going to feel like they're being unnecessarily hounded or just kind of picked apart.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and to Hope's point, if you got a power differential between like a manager and direct report, it's easy to feel like everything that I do is wrong. And if I feel like everything that I do is wrong, I stop trying. Right. And I mean, I say manager, direct report, but if we have people who have partners that you live with, or that you don't live with, but people in your life that you value, this becomes a really big issue too. I feel like I'm being nitpicked to death. Now, here's the opposite side just to pay attention to. If I am someone who isn't, all issues need to be resolved, and I'm with someone who does not give me enough of that feedback, or even, like honestly, even someone in the key issues area, I may feel that you're holding back, and I may not be able to trust you because I'm like, okay, well, what are you holding? Like, what's happening? You're not giving me everything. You don't trust me. You don't believe in me. You don't care enough to give me the feedback, right? That too can be very hurtful. And so just having the awareness that there's a continuum, and doing what you can in ways to help people be more comfortable, right? So if I'm an all issues resolved person, and I know that about myself, and you now have the language, I can then say when a new person starts, like, just so you know, this is like, I tend to, to want to resolve all the issues, but you'll know when they're really big. You'll know the ones that are big deals for me, and I'll let you know when the things are just kind of minor issues, right? That alleviates some of the fear that people may have about it, right? So the more explicit you can be, and again, we start talking about partnering in organizations, in any kinds of way, these are the types of things that processes and structure can help you create expectations so that you don't fall into expectations and then create bad blood. Make sense? All right, Marty.
Great. I think one of the things to sort of segue from what Terra was talking about is that it's so essential, right? Like we can talk about these on an individual level, right? But we understand that because organizations are human systems, they're made up of people. And so when you get enough folks who are at one end of either of those spectrums, then the organizational culture starts to tip that way. And we end up with like lots of power dynamic overlays and that sort of thing. And so again, what's important on so many levels is just to surface it and identify it and talk about it. Because then we can make individual decisions about how we're going to interact with that culture and those systems. So what I'm going to do now is move us into pairs. I am actually going to screen share for just a moment, but before I do that, is there anybody who does not have a copy of the two worksheets, the one that's storytelling in pairs instruction sheet and the other that's a scoring sheet? Everybody has them? Awesome. You all are so great. So I'm going to screen share for just one quick moment to talk through how this is going to work. So you're going to be broken up into pairs. You'll decide who's going to tell their story first. You might have already thought about this, or as I am talking about the instructions, you can be thinking about it. But think about a time in your organization when the organization thrived, right? And by organization, this could be a team, a department, any sort of subset, or the whole organization. When that organization thrived, and particularly thinking about a time of conflict or opportunity. These are sort of high stakes moments, right? This doesn't have to be epic, huge, like everything changed after that. This can be really small. We find lots of information from small moments because those are what really make up our lives. So you'll decide who's going to tell the story first. That person will tell the story, might take a minute or two. And then as the interviewer, ask them questions to get at different components of the situation. And as they're talking and as you're doing this questioning, switch over to the score sheet and just mark down on that how they land in these various categories. I'm going to pull up that score sheet for just a moment in case anybody has any questions about it. Interview scoring sheet and share. So, right, you've got this score sheet and you're just going to mark down on it what you hear. Like, oh, I'm really hearing like a really high consensus-based decision-making, or I'm really hearing that there's like a real focus on like holding professional boundaries in this. Don't, like, not every story is going to have every piece of information. Don't stress about it. This is just a taste for the kind of in-depth conversation and like scoring process we would use to get at looking at how can various organizations or departments define their organizational culture so that we can figure out how to have them merge and connect effectively. Any questions about that before I put you into your pairs? Okay, great. So I will, I'm gonna send you off into your breakout room. We've been in the pandemic long enough that you probably understand what breakout rooms are. Rachel's having issues with her AV. Okay, but she can type, great. So Rachel, you're gonna be with Hope. So Hope, you guys might have to communicate via the chat box. If you need me, you can hit the help button in your room. And otherwise, I'm going to send you right off. And I will also give you a 30-second warning when it's almost time to switch speakers.
And as Marty is sending people off, I'm going to note so the recording doesn't happen in the breakout rooms, but I'm also going to pause recording for folks who might be watching at
home. And I will bring you back together. All right. Just a second, close the rooms. Everyone will be back in 10 seconds.
People are coming back from their breakout rooms. We have resumed the recording. Welcome back.
Hello, welcome back. So I want to make some space and just open up the floor for sharing, for reflections. Amy has to leave for another meeting. Bye, Amy. Thank you so much for being with us. So yeah, I just want to open it up to hear from folks like, how was that? Did anything surprise you? Any thoughts, reflections?
I'll step up. Hope brought up a really good story, and it was based just on how our agency dealt and have been dealing with pandemic times, and everything that we were forced to change and revamp and step outside of our comfort zone. Great thing to think about. Difficult to score that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that was taken out of our hands. So though it seemed like there were unilateral decisions made because we were told what to do, it seemed to also swing on the other end because the way that we made decisions in our agency changed. So one decision was made by one person or one group of people, but then we had to come together as a group and decide how to then respond to that. and keep providing the services that we did. So though all of her examples started out on one end of the spectrum, we had to swing to the other end to then find this middle ground of how to make it work. So good job, Hope. That was definitely made me stretch my brain a little bit today.
Yeah, I think these discussions like really reiterated your point of how much of it you don't see as far as culture goes, like how hard it is to break down these specific areas and get to where you want to be.
Yeah. And how complicated it is. Like that's, you know, anytime that we're talking about, you know, there's this desire sometimes, this sort of like machine-based hyper-masculine sort of notion that like we should be able, like even the score sheet, right, is just like a very basic tool because we're like, I want a number, I want to say we are, you know, at this end, and it's more complicated than that, right? And so it's, all these tools are just that, they're just tools, technologies that we can use to surface these discussions and then, you know, get at the human part of it, because it's complicated. Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts, reflections, questions, curiosities?
No, I'll just go ahead and because Katie and I, when we were talking about the pandemic, how it did change our agency as well. And for her, one of her programs in her area, she was talking about, because the people that we support couldn't come back to our building during the pandemic, and that really changed a lot. But we still had contracts with a major, well, with Caterpillar, and we still were doing packaging stuff. And for us not to lay anybody off as an agency, which we were able to not to lay anybody off during this whole time, which has been fantastic. But we put people in that program and did packaging and stuff. They were still getting paychecks. But the cool thing about that, teamwork would be definitely a number 4. But stability, or there would be not really innovation, but the stability would be a number 1, because we were able to maintain that and meet our customers' what they needed us to do to keep them thriving. But consistency-based, it was a 2, because it was a somewhat, because we made that decision as an executive team and senior management. But the outcome of that was just so really good, because the process was a 1 because of the orientation, but the relationship was 1 because people got to experience what that area did they never knew, and then they have built relationships just by working with each other from all different departments. So it was a really a good benefit. So
yeah, I love that. Yeah.
So I'll mention one that wasn't epic, even though I'm epic. So Amy talked about, even though she's not here, she talked about a situation where she got a grant, and they're a web-based company. But the grant, they were trying to more physically connect with their customers. So they wanted to actually be in the community and engage their customer. And the timeline for the grant, it was a federal grant, and of course it was 6 months, and that was it. There was no negotiating that. And then the pandemic hit. So something that very much frustrated, something that she would have turned over for each team to then connect in the way they needed to you know, and complete the objectives of the grant, couldn't be done. And so then you had to compromise with what you could do during the pandemic with what they did, which changed how, you know, then they were just told how they were going to do it. So again, it was that where you would have maybe gone one direction was what she found, but it had to be much more rigid and restrictive, and it probably did interfere with how effective the grant was. But she said they did get it repeated. They got it for re-upped for another year, not as much money, but still they got it re-upped. So I guess it ended well. They still did well in a difficult situation.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, of course, like the pandemic is this whole other overlay. Like what happens in a moment of you know, I mean, I'm so sick of this word, but like unprecedented, you know, like unprecedented time, like situations that we could have thought a lot of things were going to happen this year, but that was not on my bingo card, you know? And so, what does the organization do? And I'm, you know, I mean, that's just a whole other conversation, but like, how does, in moments of stress like that, how does your organization react? What are the elements of its culture that rise up, that serve the organization? Or in some cases that rise up and you're like, oh, that really showed that there's some fragility there, you know, like we really value, and we're hearing this all the time from people, we really value personal relationships, right? Like those are really important in our organization, but we can't have lunch together. We don't see each other. We're all like in our living rooms and all that sort of stuff, you know? And so looking at how can your organization in moments of great stress really lean into those and say, okay, if personal relationships are really important, how do we make time for those? How do we make space for those? Yeah. Other thoughts, reflections?
Well, I was talking with Greg, and his organization is fairly new, and he had the opportunity to bring on some new employees to the organization. It was interesting to me about how he talked about they kind of sat down at an orientation meeting and actually talked about kind of the culture that they wanted. How were they going to interact with each other? What were the kind of the ground rules and agreements? And they talked first about how they were going to interact before they decided even what it was exactly they were going to do. And so I thought that showed a lot of consensus, and personal relationships and teamwork was a huge value there. And that's how they started out. You know, just how are we going to make decisions? What are the things on which we're going to base decisions as far as, you know, new business and so forth. And just the need for transparency with people on the team about what they thought was going well, what wasn't going well. Just starting right off the bat with that, with when the employees joined the organization, and then going on to what was the actual work. So I thought that was an interesting way to do it, and probably really important, because I know your culture really determines if you're going to be able to carry out your work or not, because the culture can very much get in the way of it. So an interesting and really probably helpful and good way to start off with new employees.
Yeah, that's great. Well, one of the things that, you know, I mean, that just reminds me of what we were talking about a little earlier, in the sense that the more sort of overt we can be and more transparent we can be about the organizational culture, the more we can continue to have conversations about it, right? Because a lot of organizations start off with, I mean, most don't have, I think, quite that awesome of a like, okay, let's be really overt about how we're going to do it. But a lot of organizations start and their culture sort of grows organically. And then you kind of end up with like the old guard and the new guard, right? Like folks who've been there a long time are like, well, this is how this organization works. And then new folks come in and they're like, but why? Why do we value like urgency over whatever? Why is it that we, you know, they'll be like, why do we have to have brown bag lunch every Friday? Like, I don't want to do that, you know? And it's like, oh, because our organizational culture is personal relationships or that sort of thing. And so the more that we can kind of get over this kind of ookiness that we can sometimes feel about like talking about culture and values, and the more we can just be really overt about it, the more people are able to say like, yeah, that really works for me, or like, oh, that's making it really hard for me to work here, you know, like, wow, like I really get, you know, I don't know, looked at sideways if I like eat in a meeting, but you know, I came from a place where like, that's just what you do because you want to show that you're so busy, you know? So it's like having these conversations is always, I think, a benefit. Any last thoughts on this particular, like these paired conversations before we transition into, we'll just talk through a couple of quick tips and then open it up for general Q&A and conversation about everything we've talked about today.
Something that I always find interesting, you kind of mentioned the new guard and the old guard. It's definitely something we see, and I think the newer generations coming into the workforce, their first instinct is to question everything. I really think that in order to be effective, we have to learn how to answer those questions, because once that understanding is there, it's a lot easier to, either realize if you're going to fit into that organization. And I think that employers need to be prepared for those that just won't fit.
Yeah, I mean, I worked for somebody who had been at their organization for a really long time, and she had sort of a default reaction of a lot of things, saying, well, the way we've always done it is, or yes, we did that, or, and she would always refer to the past. And I was like, you have to, she's like, but I'm not saying we have to do it. I just want to share the benefit of like my long institutional memory. And I was like, but do you know that like to the younger staff or just to new staff, what they're hearing is we have to keep doing it that way. So she would sort of be like, now I'm not saying we have to keep doing it this way, but what we did 10 years ago, or the way we've always done it is, like it's really important to be clear about those things, and so like, it's okay to say we like value tradition or we value like history. We don't want to be ahistorical, but we also value openness. Like we can contain multitudes, right? As organizations, we can embrace even things that feel a little contradictory, which is sort of the next phase beyond like just, scoring. And I think somebody was talking about this in the sense that like, might have been you, Rachel, talking about like, well, I could score sort of at both ends of this spectrum, depending on like which way I look at the situation, which is where we get into the good stuff, the complexity of these organizational culture aspects.
As Hope's supervisor, she does ask a lot of questions. The good thing about that, and seriously, this has been a good thing, is when she's questioning it, first of all, she's learning how we get it, but doesn't mean that we need to continue to do that. So it does allow us maybe even better efficiencies by just and as an employer that has probably, especially for me, being at this agency for the time that I have been in here, well, we did it this way because that's the way it was. Well, that's not a good answer all the time. And I do appreciate when they look at that, and when they look at that, and it does, well, just because it was done that way doesn't mean it's the right way, and it doesn't mean that we can't adapt as long as we get the outcome that we need to make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing. So,
well, as Eric's supervisor, Hope, I did write that down, so just know it wasn't lost on me.
I'm out. I'm leaving.
I would believe it.
Well, what I love too is like there's what I'm seeing like exhibited here is also this organizational cultural value of openness, right? Of like being willing to listen and question, right? And that's the kind of thing that, let's say you're interviewing somebody to join the organization or you're onboarding someone, like to be able to sort of say, like, one of the things that we really value here, part of our organizational culture that is part of it and that we're trying to even build and lean into is openness and willingness to and we're interested in question, right? In the same way that you might say, we value risk and failure, that those making mistakes are important. Because then you're coming into it and you understand, you're not sort of waiting for somebody to mention that whether it's okay or not to like question things. And you're not like, okay, well, I wonder whether or not this is an okay place for me to be this kind of person. So.
I had the interesting experience that I worked for Epic, only it was called something different then, in the late 90s, and I left and went to an organization where I worked for 17 and a half years, and then I came back to Epic after that in a totally different role, just totally different role. But it was interesting to me how much the culture had changed. And if had it remained the same, I probably never would have gone back. But it had just changed so much. The leadership had changed, although many of the same people are there. And I've worked with both Eric and Kim in the past when I was there the first time, but we can change the culture, even though I'm sure it wasn't an easy job to do. But it's just so nice to come back and see that it can happen, because I think culture is very hard to change sometimes, and you have to be very deliberate about it. And but I appreciated that, the ability to give your opinion and push back, treating people with respect. I'm very focused on the mission. It's just really fun to go back and see all that. So.
Well, and that's super powerful, right? To figure out, to like have these conversations around like, in what ways is our organizational culture serving us? In what ways is it maybe holding us back? Like, how do we build on what's really working? And how do we then like use that to potentially like counteract things that aren't as functional, right? And so, but you can't change it unless you can name it. So these conversations are really important. So we've got just 11 minutes left. Janita, are you gonna screen share the tips and what do we say? Tips and truths? And we can, I feel like I've been talking a lot, so maybe Terra, you lead us through this.
Absolutely. So you all should have this, and we're not gonna read this through, but I think the highlight, like if you've got nothing out of this couple hours, is like, you guys work for great organizations. Janita's kind of cool, and so is Marty. But if you want to take any lessons away, like, it starts with knowing what your own organizational culture is, lived and espoused, right? Hopefully these exercises have shown you that there's probably a lot of unwritten part of culture that you really value, that comes out, particularly in a crisis like the pandemic, that you want to make sure you're honoring and cherishing, and also being intentional about maintaining, right? There is a difference between what's happening at the top and what's happening at the front line and everywhere in between. It doesn't have to be the same, but you have to know it's not the same and know the impact of that. And then decide if that's something that you want to maybe create more synergies across the organization. I'm curious, as you go through these, is there any one of these that you would like us to double click on, to open up and talk about? Well, then maybe we should just do Q&A. Use our last 11-ish, less than 11, 10 minutes.
10, yeah.
Talking about what matters most. What questions do you have or comments you want to make?
So I would want some direction. I mean, you guys probably have resources and whatnot, or suggestions on like going off of what you just said. So it's always difficult. There's always going to be, whether it's a parent or child relationship, there's always going to be, supposedly, well, they're in charge and I got to do what they do. And so whether it's a pandemic or not, trying to respectfully say, I do know you're in a different position, and communicate, just because I'm doing this doesn't mean I'm not recognizing you're in a different situation or you're dealing with. So again, we've got 24/7 residential. Mm-hmm. Those people are burning out. So even though I may stay later, but just going in there and just saying, I hope you guys are okay, and I hope you can have a good weekend, and I hope you were able to find the staff, but is that enough? I mean, how else can we better communicate? We have a culture of, we understand and we respect what you're doing, and it's over the top or whatever.
Oh, I love that question. And I've got some ideas, and Marty, then if anything comes for you. One of the best, particularly when, like, we understand, we empathize, like there's a whole set of kind of cultural values around, like, I want to connect with you. I want to show you that I care about you. And then for some reason, we've decided that the only way that I can tell you that is that I have to somehow predict in my own head what you want and then say that to you. Really, in fact, like, I understand is, I want to lean in and ask you what you need, right? I hear you is the set for empathy. So to say, look, I know you're burning out, right? We actually really value you. Like, what would be helpful right now from us? How can we best support you? Like, what do you want the rest of the organization to know about? Like, so, you know, empathy is I hear you. And so like, go to people, and this, and just in general, like if you want to reward somebody, ask them what would be nice, right? Like what would they want to have? And at that point, they're always going to give you the right answer. You may find that they actually know that you care, and you staying late in your office means nothing to me. Like if you think you're showing solidarity, you're not, because you don't help me at all, right? You just make your own life hard. All right, so just have the conversation, and they'll tell you like, or they may say like, like the fact that y'all are off having Zoom happy hours when we can't be on those Zoom happy hours, that may be the rub, and then you can work to deal with that.
I have a question too. You touched upon how organizational culture can't be defined by only speaking to those at the top, and to realize that it's different at different levels. But how do you justify that, and how do you go about that conversation?
I mean, I think that, you know, this is sort of the rub there, I think, is the fact that, like, well, I think there's two things. One is that oftentimes folks who are either new to an organization or new in their career or on more on the front lines really undercut their power, like don't understand that they can actually request, ask, even demand to be talked to about these things. You know, I think that there's oftentimes, I mean, this is coming from somebody who's like been front lines up to, you know, like director level. Like when I was on the front lines, I was like, I could do that ED's job in my sleep. Like, I mean, I really would say shit like that, you know, and you know, and I was like, I didn't really get what they did. And I was also like, you know, they don't understand us and they don't want to hear, you know. And then once I was sort of like manager and director, I was like, would try to keep that in mind, such that I was like really asking and trying to display openness, because I was like, I desperately need to know what is happening on every level. And I'm also trying to balance the needs of, you know, 50 individuals within an organization. So I would just say that, like, it's the conversation can be initiated from any quarter. That the, unless, I mean, of course there's extreme cases where it's like, all right, we've got, you know, somebody at the top who's super like protective of their power and doesn't actually want to, you know, doesn't want to hear it, or, you know, there's all kinds of things that can complicate that conversation. But just starting to have it is something that can be powerfully initiated from anywhere in an organization, especially if it's framed as like, I want to talk about this, and less as like going from zero to a list of demands, you know, which happens particularly when like organization, like subgroups want like unionize or whatever. And it's like, we've gone from, and I'm not anti-union, just to be clear. But sometimes it's like, the perception is we're not going to get anywhere unless we go hard at this from the beginning. Whereas oftentimes, especially in nonprofit settings, just coming at it with like, I want to talk about this. And organizational culture is a great frame for talking about power dynamics and talking about what's really going on in an organization in a way that's not saying you at the top are screwing up and making people really defensive, or from the top down saying like, you know, this is the way things are, and so this is the way it has to be, but really going into conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Terra, would you add anything to that?
No, that sounds great. You know, and there are ways to do it. So it's always harder to bubble it up from the top, from the bottom to the top. You know, but you know, Greg mentioned that in his organization, some people were saying like, okay, some of these decisions didn't feel like they were in alignment with our values, right? We value collaboration. There's a way to say that. There's like, you don't listen to me. That's against our values, and it's whiny, and no one, and there's not a way to understand that at a senior level because I have a blind spot, right? Because I just know what feels true from my lens. But there's a productive way to say, okay, this decision that we went through, it feels different from kind of how I thought we were operating. Let's talk about this. And that's the place that all of a sudden you can say, oh, well, you know what, collaboration does not mean harmony, and we probably need some better agreements about how decisions will be made up front. And so often these things, like the more of the hidden things that you can make visible and explicit, the easier it is for everyone to operate. At that point you go, okay, I get it now. So when we make decisions at this level, they're going to be like this, even though decisions at this level for reasons are made a different way. Other questions?
I want to actually,
2 minutes, sorry.
I was going to say, I want to express a culture of cognizant of people's time, gratitude, and also openness. So I want to make sure that we end on time. So unfortunately, we are not going to have time for more questions. I do, though, want to express my gratitude, and hope all of you will express your gratitude to Terra and Marty. If we can all either give them an actual hand or an electronic hand, that would be great. I think this is wonderful. But in terms of openness, you'll be receiving a survey shortly via email. Please complete that. We take your feedback to heart and helps us figure out what future topics to cover and in what ways to cover them. Thank all of you for participating today. I'll send out, or Emily will send out, the last handout on tips and truths, and also a copy of Terra's slide. My thanks to Emily for leading us today, as she always does, through all the hard logistics. Terra and Marty, I think, are putting their email addresses in the chat in case you have questions in the future. But go forth and enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for participating. Really appreciate it.